Standing in my wedding dress at the altar, watching my fiancé walk back down the aisle with his ex-wife while 300 guests stared in stunned silence, I thought my life was over. What I didn't know was that Marcus had just handed me the keys to destroying both their futures, and I was about to become very good at using them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moment that changed everything wasn't when he said he couldn't go through with the wedding. It wasn't even when Victoria appeared at the back of the church like some twisted romance movie villain. It was when Marcus whispered, "She needs me, Elena. Her cancer is back," loud enough for the front rows to hear, thinking it would make him look noble instead of like the lying, manipulative coward he actually was. Because standing there in my grandmother's vintage lace, watching the man I'd planned to spend my life with choose someone else in front of everyone I cared about, I realized something important. Marcus had always underestimated me. He thought I was the sweet, trusting architect who'd never question his stories or dig too deep into his finances. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and 6 months ago I was a successful architect with my own firm, a beautiful townhouse in downtown Portland, and what I thought was the perfect relationship with Marcus Thompson, a charming investment banker who swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and weekend getaways to his family's cabin in the mountains. We'd been together for 2 years, engaged for 8 months, and I'd believed every single lie he'd told me about his past, his finances, and most importantly, about Victoria. The morning of what should have been my wedding day started like something out of a fairy tale. My bridesmaids arrived at 7 with champagne and bagels from my favorite bakery. My sister Carmen helped me into the dress that had taken 6 months to alter, while my best friend Sophia did my makeup with the precision of a professional artist. The sun was shining through the windows of the bridal suite at the historic Benson Hotel, casting everything in that golden light that makes photographers weep with joy. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus texted me at 8:30. "Running a little behind, but everything's perfect. Can't wait to see you walk down the aisle." It was sweet, romantic even, but Marcus never texted me on the morning of important events. He was superstitious about seeing the bride before the ceremony, and he'd made such a big deal about not wanting to break tradition. But I was too caught up in the excitement to analyze his sudden change in behavior. The first real sign of trouble came at 10:15, when his best man, Jake Martinez, called Carmen instead of calling Marcus directly. I could hear the tension in Jake's voice, even from across the room, as he asked to speak with me privately. Carmen's expression shifted from confusion to concern as she listened, and when she hung up, she tried to keep her voice light. "Marcus is just dealing with some last-minute family drama," she said. But her eyes told a different story. "Jake says everything's fine, just running about 30 minutes late." 30 minutes became an hour. An hour became 2 hours. The photographer tried to keep everyone busy with pre-ceremony shots, but the energy in the room had shifted from excitement to anxiety. My mother kept checking her phone and whispering to my father in rapid Spanish, their conversations growing more heated as time passed. The bridesmaids started drinking the champagne more aggressively, and I could see them exchanging glances that said what nobody wanted to voice out loud. By noon, I knew in my heart that something was seriously wrong. Marcus was many things, but unreliable wasn't one of them. He was obsessively punctual, the kind of man who arrived 15 minutes early to everything, and got genuinely anxious when plans changed unexpectedly. The fact that he was now 2 hours late without a proper explanation sent ice through my veins. That's when Carmen pulled me aside and told me what Jake had really said. Marcus wasn't dealing with family drama. He was at the hospital with Victoria, his ex-wife, who had supposedly received devastating news about her cancer returning just hours before our wedding. According to Jake, Marcus was struggling with a moral crisis and needed time to think. I stared at my sister, trying to process what she'd just told me. Victoria Sterling, the woman Marcus claimed had been completely out of his life for over 3 years. The ex-wife he'd described as manipulative and unstable, someone who'd tried to sabotage every relationship he'd had since their divorce. The woman he'd assured me was ancient history, someone I'd never have to worry about because their marriage had been a complete disaster from start to finish. "He's at the hospital with her?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fact that my entire world was tilting off its axis. Carmen nodded, her own anger starting to show through her attempt to stay calm. "Jake says she called him this morning. crying about how the doctors gave her 6 months to live and she needed to see him one more time. Marcus apparently dropped everything and ran to her side. The bridesmaids had gone quiet, pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word. I could feel their pity radiating across the room like heat from a fire, and it made my skin crawl. These women had spent months helping me plan this wedding, listening to me gush about how perfect Marcus was, how lucky I felt to have found someone who understood me so completely. Now they were watching it all crumble in real time. "What do you want to do?" Sophia asked gently, setting down her champagne glass and moving closer. "We can call the church, tell the guests there's been a medical emergency." But I wasn't ready to give up yet. Something about the timing felt wrong. Too convenient, too perfectly dramatic. Victoria getting devastating news on the morning of my wedding. Marcus suddenly having a moral crisis about marrying me because his ex-wife was supposedly dying. It felt like a script from a bad soap opera. And I'd learned over 2 years of dating Marcus that when something felt too dramatic to be true, it usually was. "I want to go to the church," I said, surprising everyone, including myself. If Marcus is having second thoughts, he can tell me to my face in front of everyone who came to celebrate with us. The ride to the church was silent, except for the rustle of my dress and the occasional murmur from my mother, who was praying quietly in Spanish while clutching her rosary. I stared out the window at Portland's familiar streets, trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with someone who would abandon his bride on their wedding day. Marcus had always been dramatic about emotional situations, but this felt different. This felt calculated. When we arrived at St. Mary's Cathedral, I could see the confusion on the faces of our guests as they milled around outside. My aunts and uncles were clustered together, speaking in rapid Spanish, while Marcus's colleagues from the bank stood awkwardly near the entrance, checking their phones and looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. The wedding coordinator, a supremely organized woman named Patricia, rushed over the moment she saw me. "Elena, thank goodness," she said, her professional composure cracking slightly. "We've been trying to reach Marcus for over an hour. His best man said there was some kind of emergency. But we have 300 people here, and the church is booked for another wedding at 4 o'clock. I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin, channeling every ounce of confidence I'd learned during 10 years of running my own business. "Is the groom here or not?" Patricia's uncomfortable expression told me everything I needed to know, but before she could answer, I heard a commotion near the church steps. Voices were rising, people were turning to look, and through the crowd I saw him. Marcus, still in his tuxedo, walking up the stone steps with a woman I recognized from the one photo he'd shown me years ago. Victoria Sterling looked nothing like I'd expected. Marcus had described her as unstable and erratic, someone who'd let herself go after their divorce and never recovered from the failure of their marriage. But the woman walking beside him was stunning in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and expensive maintenance.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite supposedly spending the morning in a hospital. Her makeup was flawless, and she was wearing a designer dress that probably costs more than most people's monthly rent. She also looked about as sick as a runway model, which is to say, not at all. I watched them approach the church together, Marcus's hand protectively placed on the small of her back, and felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. This wasn't a man dealing with a moral crisis about his ex-wife's terminal illness. This was a man who'd been caught in a lie and was desperately trying to find a way out that didn't make him look like the villain. The crowd parted as they walked through, whispers following in their wake. I could hear fragments of conversation, people trying to piece together what was happening, why the groom was arriving with another woman instead of waiting at the altar for his bride. My mother's grip tightened on my arm, and I could feel Carmen moving closer to my other side, both of them forming a protective barrier around me. Marcus saw me standing there in my wedding dress and stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment, his face showed genuine shock, like he hadn't expected me to actually show up to my own wedding. Then his expression shifted into something I'd never seen before, a mixture of guilt and defiance that made him look like a stranger. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet courtyard. "We need to talk." I felt 300 pairs of eyes turn toward me, waiting to see how the abandoned bride would react. Would I cry? Would I scream? Would I collapse in dramatic devastation like the wronged women in movies and novels? Instead, I smiled. Not a fake smile or a brave smile, but a genuine expression of clarity that came from finally seeing the situation for what it really was. "By all means," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's talk." We moved into the church's side chapel, away from the crowd, but not away from the handful of people who followed us inside, including both sets of parents, the wedding party, and Victoria, who clung to Marcus's side like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. The late afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the stone floor and making the whole scene feel surreal. Marcus cleared his throat and launched into what was obviously a prepared speech. "Elena, I'm so sorry about the timing of this, but Victoria received some devastating news this morning. Her cancer has returned, and the doctors are saying she only has months to live. She needs someone who understands her medical history, someone who can help her navigate the treatment options." I listened to him speak, watching his face carefully, noting how his eyes kept darting to Victoria for confirmation, how his voice took on that particular tone he used when he was trying to convince me of something he wasn't entirely sure about himself. These were tells I'd learned to recognize over 2 years of dating him, small indicators that Marcus Thompson was about to feed me a story he wanted me to believe rather than the truth. "So you're calling off our wedding to take care of your ex-wife," I said when he finished, keeping my voice perfectly calm and reasonable. "It's not that simple," Marcus replied, his jaw tightening slightly. "Victoria and I have history, shared experiences that you can't understand. When someone you once loved is facing death, you don't just abandon them." Victoria spoke for the first time since they'd arrived, her voice soft and trembling in a way that would have been heartbreaking if I'd believed it was genuine. "I know this is horrible timing, and I feel terrible about ruining your special day. But when the oncologist told me this morning that the cancer had metastasized, that I might only have 6 months left, I panicked. Marcus is the only person who truly knows me, who understands what I'm going through." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and I noticed that her makeup remained perfectly intact, despite her apparent emotional distress. I also noticed something else that made my blood run cold: the bracelet on her wrist, a distinctive piece of jewelry with alternating diamonds and emeralds that I'd seen before. I'd seen it in a photo on Marcus's phone just 3 weeks ago, a picture he'd quickly closed when I'd glanced over his shoulder. "When did you find out about the cancer returning?" I asked Victoria directly, ignoring Marcus's sharp look. "This morning," she said without hesitation, "around 6:30. I got the call from Dr. Patterson's office and I just couldn't face it alone." I nodded thoughtfully, processing not just what she'd said but how she'd said it. The details were too specific, too rehearsed, like someone who'd practiced the story multiple times to make sure she got it right. More importantly, her timeline didn't make sense. Doctors' offices didn't typically call patients with cancer results at 6:30 in the morning, especially not on a Saturday. "That must have been terrifying," I said, my voice full of sympathy that I didn't feel. "Which hospital are you receiving treatment at?" "I'd like to send flowers." Victoria's eyes flickered uncertainly toward Marcus before she answered. "Portland General. Dr. Patterson is one of the best oncologists in the city." I smiled and nodded, filing away the information for later use. Portland General was where my cousin worked as a nurse in the oncology department. It would be very easy to verify whether Victoria Sterling was currently a patient there and whether Dr. Patterson had made any calls about terminal diagnoses that morning. But I wasn't done gathering information yet. "Marcus, this is obviously a difficult situation for everyone involved. I can't imagine how hard this must be for you, having to choose between your commitment to me and your loyalty to someone you once loved." Marcus's shoulders relaxed slightly, clearly relieved that I seemed to be taking this well. "Thank you for understanding, Elena. I knew you'd be compassionate about this situation." "Of course," I said. "I just have one question before we figure out how to handle this with our guests. When exactly did Victoria call you this morning? I want to understand the timeline so I can explain to everyone why you needed to leave." Marcus hesitated for just a moment, but it was long enough for me to catch it. "Around 7, he said. She was crying, completely distraught. I couldn't just ignore her when she was facing something this serious. I nodded again, maintaining my understanding expression while mentally cataloging another inconsistency. Marcus had texted me at 8:30 saying he was running late, but everything was perfect. If Victoria had called him at 7 with news about terminal cancer, why would he have texted me an hour and a half later acting like nothing was wrong? Well, I said, standing up and smoothing down my wedding dress, I think we should go talk to our guests. They deserve an explanation for why there won't be a wedding today. As we walked back toward the main part of the church, my mind was already working through the implications of what I'd just heard. The inconsistencies in their stories, the perfect timing of Victoria's supposed crisis, the way Marcus had looked more guilty than grief-stricken when he'd arrived with her. Everything about this situation felt orchestrated, like a performance designed to give Marcus an exit from our marriage that didn't make him look like the bad guy. But if this was a performance, then I needed to understand what had motivated it. Marcus wasn't the type to call off a wedding on a whim, especially not a wedding that had cost us nearly $40,000 and months of planning. There had to be something bigger going on, something that had made him desperate enough to humiliate me in front of 300 people, rather than simply having an honest conversation about whatever was really bothering him. The main sanctuary was packed with confused and increasingly restless guests. I could see my extended family clustered together near the front, my grandmother looking particularly fierce in her black dress and mantilla. Marcus's family was on the opposite side, his mother dabbing at her eyes while his father stood rigid with embarrassment. Friends and colleagues filled the remaining pews, all of them checking their phones and whispering among themselves about what was taking so long. Marcus stepped up to the microphone that had been set up for our vows, and the church fell silent. I stood beside him in my wedding dress, Victoria on his other side in her designer outfit, the three of us forming the most awkward tableau in the history of failed weddings. I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate what should have been Elena's and my wedding, Marcus began, his voice echoing through the cathedral. Unfortunately, due to a family medical emergency, we're going to need to postpone the ceremony. A murmur ran through the crowd, and I could see people leaning forward in their seats, trying to understand what kind of medical emergency would involve the groom's ex-wife. Marcus continued speaking, explaining about Victoria's cancer diagnosis and his moral obligation to support her through this difficult time. He used words like compassion, and doing the right thing, and hope you'll understand, painting himself as a noble man making a difficult but necessary sacrifice. I listened to him speak, watched the faces of our guests as they processed this information, and felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion I'd been feeling since Carmen had told me about Victoria's supposed crisis was hardening into something much more focused and dangerous. Because I knew, with the certainty that comes from years of dealing with difficult clients and complicated construction projects, that Marcus was lying to everyone in this room, including, possibly himself. When he finished his speech, I stepped forward to the microphone. The church was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming and the distant sound of traffic outside. 300 people waited to hear what the abandoned bride would say in response to her fiancé's dramatic announcement. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I know this is confusing and disappointing for everyone who came to celebrate with us. Marcus is right that this is a difficult situation, and I want everyone to know that I completely support his decision to prioritize Victoria's needs during this challenging time." I could see relief flood Marcus's face, and Victoria actually smiled slightly, both of them clearly believing they'd successfully navigated the most dangerous part of their plan. But I wasn't finished. "However," I continued, "since we're all here together, and since this situation has obviously been weighing heavily on Marcus's mind, I think it would be helpful for everyone to understand exactly what's been happening. Marcus, when did you first learn about Victoria's cancer returning?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's expression shifted from relief to uncertainty, as he realized I wasn't going to simply accept his story and disappear quietly into the background. "This morning," he said carefully. "Like I mentioned, she called around 7. "That's interesting," I said, turning to address the congregation directly. "Because according to the timeline you just gave us, Victoria received devastating news about terminal cancer at 6:30 this morning. Called you crying and distraught at 7, and yet you still sent me a text at 8:30, saying everything was perfect and you couldn't wait to marry me. The silence in the church became absolute. I could see people in the pews sitting up straighter, suddenly much more interested in the drama unfolding before them. Marcus's face had gone pale, and Victoria was staring at me with an expression that suggested she was starting to realize I wasn't the pushover they'd expected. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "this isn't the time or place for this kind of discussion." "I disagree," I replied calmly. "I think our friends and family deserve to understand why they're not witnessing a wedding today." "Victoria, could you tell everyone again which doctor called you with the news about your cancer?" Victoria's eyes darted nervously toward Marcus before she answered. "Dr. Patterson at Portland General." I smiled and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. "That's wonderful," I said. "My cousin Maria works in oncology at Portland General. I'm sure she knows Dr. Patterson well. Should we give her a call and see if she can confirm the details of your diagnosis?" The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly I thought she might actually faint. Marcus stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the situation, but the damage was already done. Everyone in the church had heard the exchange, and they were smart enough to understand the implications of my questions. "You're being ridiculous, Elena," Marcus said, his voice sharp with anger now. "This is a private medical matter. You have no right to involve other people or demand proof of Victoria's condition." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Victoria's medical information is completely private. But Marcus, your relationship with Victoria isn't private anymore, is it? You've made it very public by bringing her to our wedding and announcing to 300 people that you're choosing her over me." I turned back to the microphone, addressing the congregation one final time. "I want everyone here to know that I will not be standing in the way of Marcus and Victoria's reunion. Clearly, they have unfinished business that takes priority over the commitment Marcus made to me. I wish them both the very best in whatever future they're planning together." The dismissal in my voice was unmistakable, and I could see the impact of my words rippling through the crowd. I had just publicly released Marcus from any obligation to me while simultaneously making it clear that I didn't believe a word of their story. More importantly, I'd done it with grace and dignity, which meant that when the truth eventually came out, as I was absolutely certain it would, everyone would remember that I'd handled this situation with class while Marcus and Victoria had lied to a church full of people. As I walked back down the aisle in my wedding dress, my head held high, and my smile genuine for the first time all day, I heard the murmur of conversation starting behind me. People were already beginning to question the story they'd just heard, already starting to piece together the inconsistencies I'd highlighted. By the time Marcus and Victoria made it to the parking lot, everyone at our failed wedding would know that something didn't add up about their supposed medical emergency. But more importantly, I would know exactly where to start digging for the truth. Because Marcus Thompson had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd underestimated me, dismissed me as someone who would quietly accept whatever story he fed me and disappear without causing trouble. He was about to learn that Elena Rodriguez was not the kind of woman who disappeared quietly, and I was very, very good at uncovering lies that people thought they'd buried. The real investigation was about to begin. The first thing I did when I got home was take off the wedding dress. Not dramatically, not with tears or angry yanking at the buttons, but methodically, the way I approached everything in my professional life. I hung it carefully in the closet, smoothed out the wrinkles, and zipped it into its protective bag. Someday maybe I'd sell it or donate it, but for now it represented evidence of Marcus's betrayal, and I had learned over the years that evidence should be preserved properly. My townhouse felt different when I walked through it that evening. The flowers I'd arranged that morning were still fresh, the champagne Carmen had brought was still chilling in the refrigerator, and the gift boxes from our wedding registry were still stacked neatly on the dining room table. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 12 hours earlier, but I felt like I was seeing it all through new eyes. This was my space, my sanctuary, and Marcus had never really belonged here the way I'd convinced myself he had. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, the same way I approached any complex project that required careful planning and attention to detail. At the top of the page, I wrote Marcus Thompson investigation and underlined it twice. Then I began systematically documenting everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I needed to verify. The timeline was the most obvious place to start. Victoria's supposed call about terminal cancer at 6:30 in the morning, Marcus's call to her at 7, his text to me at 8:30 claiming everything was perfect. The story had more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese, but I needed concrete proof before I could do anything with my suspicions. I made a list of people to contact, starting with my cousin Maria at Portland General Hospital. Maria answered on the second ring, her voice warm with sympathy. "Elena, mija, I heard about what happened today. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, which was true in ways I was still discovering. "Actually, I'm calling because I need a favor. Can you tell me if someone named Victoria Sterling is currently a patient in your oncology department?" There was a pause, and I could hear Maria typing on her computer. "You know I can't give out specific patient information, but I can tell you that we don't have anyone by that name currently receiving treatment here. Why do you ask?" She claimed to have received devastating news about her cancer returning this morning from a Dr. Patterson. Would that be Dr. Michael Patterson? "Dr. Patterson is on vacation in Europe this week," Maria said carefully. "He's been gone for 10 days and won't be back until next Friday." "Elena, what's going on?" I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost physical. "Nothing I can't handle, thank you, Maria. I owe you dinner when this is all over." The second call was to Jake Martinez, Marcus's best man and supposedly his closest friend. Jake had been evasive at the church, clearly uncomfortable with whatever role he'd been asked to play in Marcus's drama. But Jake was also someone I'd known for almost as long as I'd known Marcus, and I was betting his loyalty had limits. "Elena," Jake said when he answered, his voice heavy with guilt. "I'm so sorry about today. I had no idea Marcus was going to handle things that way." "What way was he supposed to handle it?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational rather than accusatory. "I don't know. He just told me this morning that Victoria was sick, and he needed to be with her. He said you'd understand, that you were too good of a person to stand in the way when someone was facing something that serious." "When exactly did he tell you this?" "Around 8, Jake said. "He called while I was getting ready and said there was going to be a change of plans. He seemed really shaken up about Victoria's diagnosis. Another piece of the timeline that didn't fit. Marcus had supposedly learned about Victoria's cancer at 7, but he'd waited an hour to tell his best man while simultaneously texting me that everything was perfect. Either Marcus was the most compartmentalized person on the planet, or he'd been scrambling to coordinate a story that would justify what he was about to do." "Jake," I said gently, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Has Marcus been in contact with Victoria recently? Before today, I mean." The silence stretched long enough for me to know I'd hit something important. When Jake finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena, I can't. He's my friend, and he made me promise not to say anything. He humiliated me in front of 300 people," I said, letting some of my anger seep into my voice. "I think his promise to keep his secrets expired when he walked down the aisle with another woman." "They've been talking for about 2 months, Jake admitted. She reached out to him initially, said she was having financial problems and needed advice. Marcus felt bad about how their divorce ended, so he started helping her with some investments and money management. Financial problems. That was interesting, and it opened up an entirely new avenue of investigation. What kind of financial problems? I don't know the details, but from what Marcus mentioned, she'd made some bad business decisions. Something about a failed startup and debts she couldn't cover. He said she was facing bankruptcy if she couldn't figure something out. I wrote Victoria Financial Problems Bankruptcy on my legal pad and underlined it several times. A woman facing financial ruin who suddenly reconnected with her wealthy ex-husband right before his wedding. a woman who then conveniently developed terminal cancer that required immediate emotional support. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and it wasn't the romantic reunion Marcus had tried to present to our wedding guests. "Did Marcus lend her money?" I asked. "I think so, but he was weird about discussing the details. He just said he was helping her get back on her feet as a friend." After I hung up with Jake, I spent the next 3 hours diving into public records and social media, using the same research skills that had made me successful in architecture to build a comprehensive picture of Victoria Sterling's life. What I found was fascinating in the worst possible way. Victoria had indeed started a business, a high-end event planning company called Sterling Events, about 2 years ago. According to the business registration documents, she'd invested heavily in office space, staff, and marketing, positioning herself as the premium option for Portland's wealthy elite. But a quick search of court records showed that Sterling Events had been hit with multiple lawsuits over the past year, all related to failed events and unhappy clients. The most damaging case involved a society wedding, where Victoria had apparently taken a $50,000 deposit and then failed to deliver any of the promised services. The bride's family had sued for fraud, and the court documents painted a picture of systematic deception and financial mismanagement. According to the filing, Victoria had been using deposits from new clients to pay debts from previous events, creating a pyramid scheme that was always one cancellation away from collapse. But the real goldmine of information came from social media. Victoria's Instagram account was public, and it told a story that contradicted everything Marcus had said about their relationship. Far from being ancient history, their interactions were clearly documented through likes, comments, and tagged photos going back months. There were pictures of them at restaurants, hiking trails, and cultural events, all posted with captions that suggested an ongoing relationship, rather than a recent reconciliation. The most telling post was from 3 weeks ago, a photo of Victoria wearing the same diamond and emerald bracelet I'd noticed at the church. The caption read, "Feeling grateful for second chances and new beginnings," with a heart emoji and a tag of the expensive restaurant where Marcus and I had celebrated our engagement. She'd been wearing my bracelet, a piece of jewelry Marcus had given me for my birthday, to the same restaurant where he'd proposed to me. I screenshot everything, creating a digital file that documented the timeline of their relationship, alongside the timeline of our engagement. The pattern was undeniable. While Marcus had been planning our wedding, he'd been rebuilding his relationship with Victoria. While I'd been choosing flowers and tasting cakes, he'd been taking her to our special places and giving her jewelry that should have been mine. But the financial angle was what really interested me, because it suggested this wasn't just about rekindled romance. It was about money, and desperate people who needed money were capable of extraordinary deception. I needed to understand exactly how much trouble Victoria was in, and how far she and Marcus were willing to go to solve her problems. The next morning, I drove to my office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. Rodriguez Architecture was my pride and joy, a firm I'd built from nothing into one of Portland's most respected design companies. My team consisted of 6 talented architects and designers, along with my invaluable office manager, Patricia Vega, who had been with me since the beginning and knew better than anyone how to read my moods. "How are you holding up?" Patricia asked when I walked in, her voice gentle with concern. "I saw the photos from yesterday on social media. I can't believe Marcus did that to you." "What photos?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. Patricia pulled up Facebook on her computer and showed me what several of our mutual friends had posted. Pictures of me standing at the altar alone, looking confused and hurt. Images of Marcus walking up the church steps with Victoria, her hand possessively placed on his arm. A particularly damaging shot of the 3 of us standing together while Marcus explained his decision to choose her over me. The captions ranged from sympathetic to gossipy, but they all told the same basic story. Elena Rodriguez had been publicly humiliated by her fiancé, who'd left her at the altar for his ex-wife's supposed terminal illness. Some people were expressing outrage on my behalf, others were sharing their own stories of wedding disasters, and a few were already speculating about whether Marcus and Victoria had been having an affair all along. "I'm going to need you to do something for me," I told Patricia, settling into my office chair with a determination that surprised me. I need a complete financial background check on Victoria Sterling and her business, Sterling Events. Everything you can find through public records, court filings, business registrations, tax liens, the works. Patricia raised an eyebrow but didn't question my request. She'd worked with me long enough to know that when I decided to investigate something, I was thorough to the point of obsession. Should I use our usual investigative service? Yes, and tell them it's priority. I want everything they can find within 48 hours. While Patricia made the arrangements, I started working on the other piece of the puzzle. Marcus's financial situation, which I realized I'd never examined as closely as I should have. We'd kept our finances largely separate during our relationship, splitting major expenses but maintaining individual bank accounts and investment portfolios. I'd always assumed this was healthy independence, but now I wondered if it had been a way for Marcus to hide things he didn't want me to see. I knew where Marcus banked, where he worked, and roughly what his salary should be as a senior investment banker at Northwest Financial Group. But I'd never asked probing questions about his investments, his debts, or his spending habits. I'd trusted him to manage his own money responsibly, the same way he'd trusted me to manage mine. That trust was about to become my investigative advantage. Marcus had given me access to several of his accounts over the years for practical reasons. When he'd traveled for business, I'd paid bills from his checking account. When he'd been too busy to handle routine financial tasks, I'd helped with online banking and investment monitoring. He'd never changed the passwords, never revoked my access, probably because he'd never imagined I'd have reason to use it against him. Technically, accessing his accounts without permission was probably illegal, but I wasn't planning to steal anything or cause financial damage. I just wanted information, and I was careful to only look without making any changes or transactions. What I found in 30 minutes of careful browsing was more illuminating than anything Victoria's social media had revealed. Marcus's checking account showed regular transfers to an account I didn't recognize, payments that had been going on for 2 months and steadily increasing in size. The most recent transfer, made just 3 days before our wedding, was for $15,000. The memo line simply said, VS loan repayment, which I was pretty sure stood for Victoria Sterling. But that wasn't the most interesting discovery. Marcus's investment portfolio, which I'd always assumed was healthy and diverse, showed signs of significant recent activity. He'd been liquidating stocks and mutual funds, converting long-term investments into cash, at a pace that suggested either extremely poor financial planning or desperation. In the past 2 months, he'd cashed out nearly $60,000 worth of investments, taking substantial penalties for early withdrawal from retirement accounts. The pattern was clear. Marcus had been systematically converting his assets into cash, which he'd then been transferring to Victoria in increasingly large amounts. Either he was the most generous ex-husband in history, or Victoria's financial problems were much more serious than Jake had suggested, and she'd convinced Marcus that helping her was worth destroying his own financial security. I printed out everything I could access legally, creating a paper trail that documented the flow of money from Marcus to Victoria. Then I started digging deeper into Northwest Financial Group's publicly available information, looking for any clues about Marcus's standing at the company or potential workplace issues that might explain his recent behavior. What I found was a press release from 6 weeks ago, announcing that Northwest Financial was under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for potential insider trading violations. The investigation was ongoing, but several senior employees had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Marcus's name wasn't mentioned specifically, but the timing aligned perfectly with the beginning of his financial transfers to Victoria. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the documents spread across my desk, feeling pieces of a much larger puzzle starting to click into place. This wasn't just about a romantic reunion, or even about helping an ex-wife with business problems. This was about money laundering, potential SEC violations, and a desperate attempt to hide assets before they could be frozen or seized by federal investigators. Marcus hadn't left me at the altar because he'd suddenly realized he still loved Victoria. He'd left me because marrying me would have made me legally entitled to half of his assets, including money that might not have been legally his to begin with. By calling off our wedding and transferring his liquid assets to Victoria, he was protecting himself from both federal investigation and potential claims from a spouse who might ask uncomfortable questions about where the money had come from. The supposed terminal cancer diagnosis was just the cover story, a way to make his choice look noble instead of criminal. Victoria's convenient breakdown at exactly the right moment to derail our wedding wasn't coincidence. It was choreographed, planned, and executed, with the precision of people who had everything to lose if their real motivations were discovered. I picked up my phone and called my attorney, Sarah Chen, who had handled the legal aspects of starting my business and had become a trusted advisor over the years. Sarah was smart, ruthless when necessary, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to protecting her clients' interests. "Elena," Sarah said when her assistant put me through, "I heard about yesterday. I'm so sorry. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said, which was becoming my standard response. "But I need to schedule a meeting as soon as possible. I think Marcus may be involved in something illegal, and I want to make sure I'm protected from any potential legal fallout." There was a pause while Sarah processed this information. How illegal are we talking? Potentially federal securities violations, money laundering, asset concealment. The kind of illegal that involves the SEC and federal prosecutors. "Can you be in my office in an hour? I'll be there in 30 minutes. Sarah's law firm occupied 2 floors of a downtown high-rise, with views of the Willamette River and the kind of understated luxury that attracted Portland's most successful business owners. Sarah herself was a small woman with steel gray hair and the sharpest legal mind I'd ever encountered. She'd built her practice by being absolutely ruthless in protecting her clients while maintaining the highest ethical standards, a combination that had made her both feared and respected in Portland's legal community. I spread my documentation across her conference table while she reviewed everything with the methodical attention to detail that had made her so successful. Bank records, social media screenshots, court filings, SEC press releases. Everything I'd gathered in less than 24 hours of investigation. "This is impressive work," Sarah said when she finished reading. "You've identified a clear pattern of asset movement that coincides with federal investigation of his employer. The timing of the wedding cancellation is particularly suspicious given the amounts involved." "What are my options?" I asked. "That depends on what you want to accomplish. If you just want to protect yourself from potential legal exposure, we can document everything we've found and make sure you're clearly separated from any of Marcus's financial activities. If you want to cause problems for Marcus and Victoria, we have several avenues available." "What kind of problems?" Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. "The SEC investigation is ongoing, which means they're actively looking for evidence of wrongdoing. If someone were to anonymously provide them with documentation showing unusual asset transfers from a person under investigation, they might find that very interesting. Similarly, if Victoria's creditors knew she was receiving large cash payments while claiming bankruptcy, they might want to investigate her financial statements more closely. And if someone wanted to pursue civil remedies, you have clear grounds for a lawsuit against both of them for fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to defraud. The public nature of the wedding cancellation would make any settlement negotiations very uncomfortable for them, especially if media attention focused on the financial aspects of their relationship." I stared out the window at the Portland skyline, thinking about the woman I'd been yesterday morning and the woman I was becoming. 24 hours ago, I'd been a trusting fiancé who believed the best about people and gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. Today, I was someone who understood that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford when dealing with people who viewed my kindness as weakness. "I want to do all of it," I said finally. "I want them to face every possible consequence for what they've done." "Are you sure? This kind of legal action can be emotionally draining and very public. Everything will come out in court proceedings and media coverage." "Good," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "I want everyone to know exactly what Marcus Thompson and Victoria Sterling are capable of. I want their friends, their families, their colleagues, and their future victims to understand who they really are." Sarah nodded and began making notes. "We'll start with documenting everything for the SEC. That's the nuclear option, and it's irreversible once we make the call. Then we'll file civil suits for fraud and emotional distress. Finally, we'll make sure Victoria's creditors know about her sudden improvement in cash flow." "How long will all of this take?" The federal investigation could take months, but once we provide them with your documentation, Marcus's life is going to become very complicated very quickly. The civil suits will probably settle out of court, but not until after significant legal expenses and media attention. Victoria's creditors will move fast once they realize she's been hiding assets. And Marcus's career? Investment bankers under federal investigation don't tend to stay employed very long, especially when there's documentation of suspicious financial activity. Even if the SEC doesn't file charges, his employer will probably terminate him to avoid association with the scandal. I thought about Marcus standing at that microphone, telling 300 people that he was making a noble sacrifice to help someone in need. The satisfaction of knowing that his noble gesture was about to destroy everything he'd worked for was almost overwhelming. One more thing, I said. I want to make sure Victoria's cancer story is exposed for the lie it is. People donated money at the church yesterday, thinking they were helping someone who was dying. That's fraud, potentially mail fraud if any solicitation happened across state lines. We can definitely pursue that angle. As I left Sarah's office, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because I was pursuing revenge, though I wasn't going to pretend that wasn't part of it, but because I was finally taking action instead of being acted upon. For too long, I'd been reactive in my relationship with Marcus, accepting his explanations and trusting his judgment, even when my instincts told me something was wrong. Now I was being proactive, using my skills and resources to uncover the truth and ensure that actions had appropriate consequences. Marcus and Victoria had made a calculated decision to destroy my life for their own benefit. They were about to learn that Elena Rodriguez was not someone who could be destroyed easily, and I was much better at calculated decisions than they were. The documentation Patricia's investigative service had compiled arrived the next morning, and it was even more damaging than I'd hoped. Victoria's financial situation was catastrophic in ways that went far beyond normal business failure. She owed money to suppliers, venues, contractors, and clients, with judgments and liens totaling over $200,000. Her personal credit was destroyed, her business accounts had been frozen by multiple creditors, and she was facing potential criminal charges for fraud related to the wedding deposit scheme Jake had mentioned. But the most interesting discovery was that Victoria had been using multiple identities to secure credit and business relationships. Victoria Sterling was her married name, but she'd also been operating under her maiden name, Victoria Chen, and a completely fabricated identity, Victoria Morrison. Each identity had its own credit profile, business registrations, and financial obligations, creating a complex web of deception that had allowed her to hide the true extent of her debts. The investigative report also revealed that Victoria's supposed cancer history was as fictional as her current diagnosis. There were no medical records indicating she'd ever been treated for cancer, no insurance claims for oncology services, no prescription records for chemotherapy or other cancer medications. The entire medical crisis that had justified Marcus's wedding day betrayal was a complete fabrication. I made copies of everything and drove to Sarah's office, where we spent 2 hours organizing the evidence into packages for different recipients. The SEC would get documentation of Marcus's asset transfers and potential money laundering. Victoria's creditors would receive proof that she was hiding significant cash payments while claiming inability to pay her debts. The district attorney's office would get evidence of the fake cancer story and solicitation of donations under false pretenses. "This is going to destroy them," Sarah said as we sealed the last envelope. "Are you prepared for how they might react when they realize what's happening?" "What do you mean?" "Desperate people do desperate things. When Marcus and Victoria understand that their entire scheme is unraveling, they might try to retaliate against you. We should discuss security precautions and legal protections." I hadn't considered the possibility that Marcus might become dangerous when cornered, but Sarah was right to think about it. The man who'd humiliated me in front of 300 people had already demonstrated he was capable of cruelty when it served his purposes. If he was facing federal charges and financial ruin, he might decide he had nothing left to lose. "What kind of precautions?" I asked. "Restraining orders, security system upgrades, possibly a private investigator to monitor their activities for a while. I have contacts who specialize in this kind of protective service." As we made arrangements for my safety, I felt a chill of fear that was entirely different from the anger and determination I'd been feeling. This was no longer just about exposing lies and ensuring consequences. This was about protecting myself from people who might be willing to do anything to avoid facing the results of their choices. But even the fear didn't diminish my resolve. If anything, it reinforced my certainty that Marcus and Victoria were exactly the kind of people who needed to be stopped before they could hurt anyone else. I'd been their victim, but I didn't have to remain one. I could choose to be the person who made sure their ability to victimize others came to an end. The first envelope went to the SEC that afternoon, hand-delivered by a courier service that specialized in legal documents. By the time Marcus and Victoria realized what was happening, federal investigators would already be reviewing evidence of their financial crimes. There would be no opportunity to destroy records, no chance to create alternative explanations, no way to avoid the scrutiny that was about to turn their lives upside down. The second phase of my plan would begin the next morning, when Victoria's creditors started receiving anonymous tips about her hidden assets. But tonight, I was going to enjoy one last evening of being the only person who knew exactly what was coming. Tomorrow, Marcus and Victoria's carefully constructed house of lies would start collapsing around them, and I was going to have a front-row seat to watch it happen. The first sign that my plan was working came at 6:47 on Tuesday morning, when my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, but the desperate edge in Marcus's voice when he left his message told me everything I needed to know about how his week was going. "Elena, we need to talk. There's been some kind of misunderstanding, and I think someone's been spreading false information about Victoria and me. Please call me back as soon as you get this. It's urgent." I deleted the message without calling him back. By Tuesday morning, the SEC would have had my documentation for 18 hours, long enough to verify the basic facts and begin preparing their response. Marcus's phone call meant they'd already contacted him, probably requesting an interview or demanding additional financial records. The urgency in his voice suggested he was starting to understand that his carefully planned escape route was turning into a trap. The second call came 20 minutes later, this time from Victoria. Her voicemail was more composed than Marcus's, but I could hear the strain underneath her practiced calm. "Elena, I know you're upset about what happened at the wedding, and I completely understand why you'd want to lash out. But whatever you think you know about my situation, you're wrong. I really am sick. And Marcus really is just trying to help a friend through a difficult time. Please don't let your hurt feelings cause problems for innocent people." Innocent people. The audacity was breathtaking. But it also revealed something important about Victoria's mindset. Even now, with federal investigators presumably breathing down her neck, she was still trying to manipulate the narrative. She still believed she could charm her way out of consequences, still thought she could frame herself as the victim of a vindictive ex-fiancé. I saved both voicemails, adding them to the growing file of evidence that documented Marcus and Victoria's panic as their scheme unraveled. Then I drove to my office, where Patricia was waiting with updates from our investigative service and a stack of morning newspapers that would make this day even more interesting than I'd expected. "You're not going to believe this," Patricia said, spreading the Portland Tribune across my desk. The headline made me smile for the first time since my wedding day. "Local investment banker under federal investigation for securities fraud." The article was thorough and damaging, reporting that Marcus Thompson of Northwest Financial Group was being investigated by the SEC for potential insider trading violations. More importantly, it mentions that investigators were examining unusual financial transfers made during the investigation period, suggesting possible attempts to hide assets or obstruct justice. The reporter had clearly done their homework, because they'd connected Marcus's recent engagement cancellation to the timeline of the federal investigation. "How did the media find out so quickly?" I asked. "Anonymous tip to the financial crime reporter," Patricia said with a knowing smile. "Apparently someone provided them with very detailed documentation about the timing of certain asset transfers." I hadn't told Patricia to contact the media, but I appreciated her initiative. Public attention would make it much harder for Marcus to find new employment or convince anyone to trust him with their money. It would also put pressure on Northwest Financial Group to distance themselves from the scandal as quickly as possible. The phone rang while I was reading the article, and I recognized the number as belonging to Carmen, my sister. "Elena, have you seen the news? Marcus is all over the financial section, and they're saying he might go to prison for fraud." "What's happening?" "Justice," I said simply. Marcus made some very poor choices, and now he's facing the consequences. Did you have anything to do with this? I provided information to the appropriate authorities. What they chose to do with that information was their decision. Carmen was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I'd just told her. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you safe? If Marcus is desperate enough to commit federal crimes, what might he do to the person who exposed him? The question had been nagging at me since my conversation with Sarah, but hearing it from Carmen made it feel more immediate and dangerous. I've taken precautions, I said. Sarah has arranged for security monitoring, and I've got restraining orders being prepared. Maybe you should stay with me and David for a while until this settles down. I'm not hiding from Marcus Thompson, I said, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. I'm not going to let him drive me out of my own home after everything he's already done. But even as I said it, I was already thinking about the additional security measures Sarah had recommended. The private investigator she'd suggested, the upgraded alarm system, the concealed carry permit I'd been considering for months. Marcus and Victoria had already proven they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect their interests. I needed to be prepared for the possibility that they might view me as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated. The morning brought a steady stream of phone calls from reporters, former clients, and curious acquaintances who'd heard about Marcus's legal troubles and wanted to know if I had any comment. I referred all media inquiries to Sarah and kept my responses to personal calls brief and non-committal. The story was spreading exactly the way I'd hoped it would, creating a public record of Marcus's crimes that would follow him for the rest of his career. At 11:30, Patricia buzzed me to say that 2 men in suits were asking to speak with me. I looked out my office window and saw a black sedan parked in front of the building, the kind of nondescript government vehicle that federal agents drove when they wanted to seem official but not threatening. Send them up, I said, smoothing my hair and checking my appearance in the mirror behind my desk. I had been expecting this visit since I'd submitted my documentation to the SEC, but I still felt a flutter of nervousness as I heard their footsteps in the hallway. Special Agent David Kim and Special Agent Jennifer Torres introduced themselves with the kind of polite professionalism that immediately established they were serious people conducting a serious investigation. Agent Kim was tall and thin, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my office. Agent Torres was younger, probably in her early 30s, with short black hair and an intensity that suggested she took her job very personally. Ms. Rodriguez, Agent Kim said as they settled into the chairs across from my desk, we're here to discuss the documentation you provided regarding Marcus Thompson and Victoria Sterling. We'd like to ask you some questions about your relationship with Mr. Thompson and your knowledge of his financial activities. I'm happy to cooperate, I said, but I should mention that I've retained legal counsel. Would you prefer to conduct this interview with my attorney present? That's your right, Agent Torres said, but at this point you're not a subject of our investigation. We're simply trying to understand the timeline of Mr. Thompson's asset transfers and the nature of his relationship with Ms. Sterling. They spent the next hour asking detailed questions about my relationship with Marcus, my knowledge of his work at Northwest Financial Group, and my awareness of his financial relationship with Victoria. I answered everything honestly, providing additional documentation when they requested it, and explaining how I'd discovered the pattern of transfers and liquidations. You've conducted a very thorough investigation, Agent Kim said when we finished. Have you considered a career in federal law enforcement? I'm quite happy being an architect, I said, but I appreciate the compliment. Agent Torres leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. Ms. Rodriguez, I need to ask you about your safety. Mr. Thompson and Ms. Sterling are facing potentially serious federal charges, and people in their situation sometimes make poor decisions when they feel cornered. Have you noticed any unusual activity around your home or office? Any sense that you're being watched or followed? Not yet, I said, but my attorney has arranged for security monitoring as a precaution. Good. We'd also like to provide you with a contact number for our office. If you notice anything concerning, anything at all, we want you to call immediately. People who expose financial crimes sometimes become targets for retaliation. They left me with business cards and the unsettling knowledge that federal agents were genuinely concerned about my safety. I called Sarah immediately and asked her to accelerate the timeline for the private investigator and security system upgrades. If the FBI thought Marcus and Victoria might be dangerous when cornered, I needed to take that threat seriously. The afternoon brought news that Northwest Financial Group had placed Marcus on indefinite administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigation. According to the company's carefully worded press release, they were cooperating fully with authorities and had zero tolerance for any violations of securities regulations. Reading between the lines, Marcus Thompson's career in investment banking was over, regardless of whether the government eventually filed criminal charges. But the real satisfaction came at 4:15, when Patricia buzzed me with news that made all the stress and uncertainty of the past few days worthwhile. Elena, you need to see this. Victoria Sterling just got arrested. I pulled up the local news website and found a breaking news story with a photo that made me smile wider than I had in months. Victoria Sterling, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, being led into the Multnomah County Jail on charges of fraud, identity theft, and solicitation under false pretenses. According to the article, her arrest was the result of a joint investigation by the Portland Police Bureau and the FBI, focusing on her use of multiple identities to defraud creditors, and her solicitation of donations based on false claims about terminal cancer. The most damaging detail was buried in the third paragraph. Investigators had found evidence that Victoria had collected over $30,000 in donations from sympathetic friends and strangers who believed she was dying, money that she'd used to pay personal debts and maintain her lifestyle while claiming poverty to creditors. My phone rang immediately, and I wasn't surprised to see Marcus's number on the caller ID. This time I answered. "Elena, we need to talk right now," Marcus said without preamble. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Victoria's been arrested, I'm under federal investigation, and I know you're behind all of it." "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly. "I hope you're having a good day. Don't play games with me. I know what you did, and I know why you did it. You're upset about the wedding, and you decided to destroy our lives out of spite." "I'm upset about being lied to by someone I trusted," I corrected. "The fact that exposing your lies resulted in federal charges suggests the problem isn't my spite, it's your criminal behavior." "Criminal behavior?" "I was helping someone I cared about through a medical crisis. There's nothing criminal about that." "There's nothing medical about Victoria's crisis," I said. "She's never had cancer, Marcus. She's never even been treated for cancer. The whole story was a lie designed to justify your wedding day betrayal and cover up the real reason you were giving her money." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to wonder if Marcus had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, flatter, more dangerous. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. "Victoria and I were trying to solve problems, not create them. The money I gave her was legitimate help for someone in trouble." "The money you gave her was evidence of money laundering," I said. "You were under federal investigation for securities violations, and instead of cooperating with authorities, you decided to hide assets by transferring them to someone using multiple false identities. That's not helping a friend, Marcus. That's obstruction of justice. You can't prove any of that. I don't have to prove it. The FBI has already proven it, using the documentation I provided. Your phone records, bank records, email communications, everything. Victoria's arrest is just the beginning." "Elena, listen to me very carefully," Marcus said, and something in his tone made me sit up straighter. "You need to call the FBI and tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you misunderstood what you saw, that you were emotionally compromised after the wedding cancellation. You need to retract your statements and withdraw your evidence." "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, you're going to regret it. I've lost my job, my reputation, and probably my freedom because of what you've done. Victoria's facing years in prison because you couldn't handle being rejected. But this doesn't have to get worse for everyone involved." The threat was unmistakable, even though Marcus was being careful not to say anything explicitly incriminating over the phone. He was telling me to sabotage the federal investigation or face retaliation. He was betting that fear would make me back down, that I'd choose my personal safety over seeing justice done. He was betting wrong. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not retracting anything. I'm not withdrawing any evidence. Victoria is a criminal who used multiple false identities to defraud creditors, and solicit money under false pretenses. You're a criminal who violated federal securities laws and attempted to hide assets from investigators. Both of you are going to face the full consequences of your actions, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop that from happening. Elena. I'm not finished, I interrupted. If you or anyone acting on your behalf comes near me, my home, my office, or anyone I care about, I will consider it attempted intimidation of a federal witness. The FBI has already expressed concern about potential retaliation, and they're monitoring the situation very closely. So if you're thinking about doing something stupid to try to silence me, I suggest you reconsider. I hung up without waiting for his response, then immediately called Agent Torres to report the conversation. She took detailed notes and assured me that they would be documenting Marcus's attempt to influence my cooperation with their investigation. She also mentioned that they'd been monitoring his communications since the investigation began, which meant they probably had recordings of his threats. We'll be increasing our surveillance of both Mr. Thompson and Ms. Sterling, Agent Torres said. Ms. Sterling is currently in custody, but Mr. Thompson is still free, pending the completion of our investigation. We're taking his implicit threats very seriously. What should I do if he tries to contact me again? Don't answer any calls from him, and report any attempts at contact immediately. We're also going to recommend that local police increase patrols in your neighborhood for the next few weeks. As I hung up, I realized that Marcus's phone call had actually done me a favor. By threatening a federal witness, he'd likely upgraded his potential charges from financial crimes to obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. He was digging his own grave deeper with every desperate attempt to escape the consequences of his actions. The next few days passed in a blur of media attention, legal meetings, and security preparations. The story had grown beyond the financial pages into general news, with reporters fascinated by the connection between securities fraud and a wedding day betrayal. Several national news outlets picked up the story, focusing on the dramatic elements of a bride left at the altar by a fiancé who turned out to be a federal criminal. I gave one carefully scripted interview to a local television station, choosing my words to focus on the importance of reporting financial crimes rather than the personal aspects of my relationship with Marcus. The segment aired during the evening news, showing me in my office looking professional and composed, while explaining that concerned citizens had a responsibility to cooperate with federal investigations. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. My office received dozens of calls from potential clients who'd seen the interview and wanted to work with an architect who'd shown such courage in difficult circumstances. Carmen called to say that our extended family was proud of how I'd handled the situation, and even some of Marcus's former colleagues reached out to express their support for my decision to expose his crimes. But the most satisfying response came from an unexpected source. Jake Martinez called on Friday afternoon, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine remorse. Elena, I owe you an apology, he said. I should have told you the truth about Marcus and Victoria months ago. I knew something wasn't right about their relationship, but I convinced myself it wasn't my business to get involved. What changed your mind? I asked. Seeing Victoria get arrested, reading about the fake cancer story, understanding that Marcus was committing federal crimes. I realized I'd been protecting someone who didn't deserve protection, and I'd failed someone who did. Jake, you couldn't have known how far they were willing to go. Maybe not, but I knew Marcus was lying to you about Victoria, and I should have said something. I let my loyalty to a friend override my obligation to do the right thing. We talked for 20 minutes, with Jake providing additional details about Marcus's behavior over the past few months that supported the pattern of deception I'd uncovered. He mentioned mood swings, secretive phone calls, and growing paranoia about money that all made sense in the context of someone conducting financial crimes while under federal investigation. Is there anything I can do to help with the legal proceedings? Jake asked as our conversation wound down. Just tell the truth if anyone asks you questions, I said. That's all any of us can do at this point. The formal charges came the following Monday, announced in a Department of Justice press release that laid out the full scope of Marcus and Victoria's crimes. Marcus was indicted on charges of securities fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. Victoria faced charges for identity theft, fraud, solicitation under false pretenses, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The potential sentences ranged from 5 to 20 years in federal prison, depending on cooperation and plea negotiations. The press release also mentioned that both defendants had attempted to flee the jurisdiction before their arrests, with Marcus caught at Portland International Airport trying to board a flight to Switzerland, and Victoria arrested while attempting to cross into Canada using one of her false identities. The additional charges for flight risk would likely increase their sentences and eliminate any possibility of pretrial release. Reading the charges, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Marcus and Victoria had made calculated decisions to commit crimes, to lie to people who trusted them, and to try to escape consequences through manipulation and deception. Now they would face a legal system that didn't care about their charm, their sob stories, or their ability to manipulate emotions. Sarah called that afternoon with news about the civil suits we'd filed against both Marcus and Victoria. Their criminal defense attorneys want to discuss settlement, she said. They're concerned that fighting the civil charges will create additional evidence for the federal prosecutors. What kind of settlement are they proposing? Full restitution for all wedding expenses, plus damages for emotional distress and defamation. We're talking about roughly $200,000 from Marcus and another $100,000 from Victoria, assuming she has any assets left after paying her creditors. Will she have any assets left? Doubtful. The FBI has frozen all her accounts and seized her property as evidence. She's also facing civil suits from dozens of creditors who want their money back. By the time all the legal proceedings are finished, Victoria Sterling will be starting over with nothing. And Marcus? His situation is better financially, but his career is over. No financial services company will ever hire him again, and his investment losses from liquidating his portfolio have cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even if he avoids prison time, he'll be starting over in a new field with a criminal record. I thought about the man who'd stood in front of 300 people and told them he was making a noble sacrifice to help someone in need. The irony was that he'd been telling the truth, just not in the way he'd intended. He had made a sacrifice to help Victoria, but there had been nothing noble about it. He'd sacrificed his career, his freedom, his reputation, and his future to help a criminal hide stolen money. Accept the settlement offer, I said. I want this finished so I can move on with my life. The money wasn't important to me, but the admission of guilt that came with the settlement was. Marcus and Victoria would be paying damages for fraud, acknowledging in legal documents that they had deliberately deceived me and caused intentional harm. The settlement would become part of the public record, another piece of evidence that documented their crimes and their character. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later, when Marcus and Victoria were both in court for their plea hearings. I wasn't required to attend, but Sarah suggested that my presence might influence their decisions about whether to accept plea deals or fight the charges at trial. The courthouse was packed with reporters, federal agents, and curious spectators who'd followed the story through weeks of media coverage. I sat in the second row, directly behind the prosecution table, where Marcus and Victoria would be forced to see me every time they turned around. Marcus looked terrible, like he'd aged years in the few weeks since his arrest. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he'd lost weight, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled. Victoria looked better physically, but there was something broken in her posture that suggested she'd finally accepted that her charm and manipulation weren't going to save her. They both pleaded guilty to all charges, accepting plea deals that would send Marcus to federal prison for 8 years and Victoria for 12 years. The additional time for Victoria reflected her more extensive criminal history and her use of multiple false identities to defraud dozens of victims. When the judge asked Marcus if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood up slowly and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the courtroom. I want to apologize to Elena Rodriguez, he said, his voice barely audible over the courtroom murmur. She trusted me, and I betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. I let greed and fear drive me to commit crimes that hurt innocent people, including someone who deserved much better from me. It was probably the most honest thing Marcus had said in months, but it was too little and far too late. I didn't acknowledge his apology, didn't nod or show any emotion. I just stared at him until he looked away and sat back down. Victoria didn't apologize or even look in my direction. When given the opportunity to speak, she simply said, "No comment, Your Honor," and remained seated with her head down. As the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but something closer to pity. They had destroyed their own lives through a series of increasingly desperate decisions, and now they would spend the next decade in federal prison thinking about how different things might have been if they'd simply been honest about their problems. But the pity was brief and quickly replaced by relief. Marcus and Victoria would never be able to hurt anyone else the way they'd hurt me. Other women would never have to wonder if their fiancés were secretly criminals. Other creditors would never lose money to Victoria's fraudulent schemes. The legal system had worked exactly the way it was supposed to, protecting future victims by holding criminals accountable for their actions. I walked out of the courthouse into bright autumn sunshine, breathing deeply for the first time in weeks. The reporters shouted questions as I passed, but I kept walking toward my car without responding. I'd said everything I needed to say through the legal system, and now it was time to focus on rebuilding my life instead of dismantling theirs. 6 months later, I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop reading the newspaper when I saw a small item buried in the business section. Marcus Thompson had been transferred to a minimum security federal prison in California, where he was serving as a tutor for other inmates working toward their GED certificates. Victoria Sterling had been placed in administrative segregation at a women's facility in Texas after several incidents with other prisoners who'd targeted her for her financial crimes. I folded the newspaper and put it aside, no longer interested in following their stories. They had become footnotes in my life, cautionary tales about the consequences of betrayal and deception, but they were no longer the central figures in my personal narrative. The coffee shop was busy with the usual morning crowd of professionals, students, and freelancers who made downtown Portland such a vibrant place to work. I'd been coming here every Friday morning for months, a ritual that helped me appreciate how much my life had changed since that disastrous wedding day. Rodriguez architecture was thriving, with more projects than I could handle and a growing reputation for innovative design and ethical business practices. The media attention from the federal case had brought me dozens of new clients who wanted to work with someone they could trust completely. I'd hired 2 additional architects and moved to a larger office space to accommodate our growing team. My personal life was quieter, but infinitely more peaceful. I'd bought a small house in the Alberta district, a cozy craftsman bungalow with original hardwood floors and a garden that kept me busy on weekends. I'd adopted a rescue dog named Frida, a German Shepherd mix who'd been abandoned by her previous owners and seemed to understand that we both deserved better treatment than we'd received. Dating was still complicated, but I'd started seeing an environmental lawyer named Daniel who specialized in water rights and sustainable development. He was patient, honest about his own past mistakes, and completely uninterested in rushing into anything serious. We'd been taking things slowly for 3 months, building a foundation of friendship and respect that felt more solid than the passionate intensity I'd shared with Marcus. Carmen had pointed out that I seemed more like myself than I had in years, more confident and decisive, less worried about other people's opinions, and more focused on my own goals and values. The woman who'd stood at that altar in her grandmother's lace had been too trusting, too willing to accept explanations that didn't quite make sense. The woman who'd walked out of that courthouse 6 months later had learned to verify before trusting, to ask hard questions, and to prioritize her own well-being over other people's convenience. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there were still moments when I wondered what my life might have looked like if Marcus had been the man I'd thought he was. But those moments were becoming rarer, replaced by gratitude for the life I was actually living instead of the life I'd thought I wanted. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, asking if I wanted to join him for dinner and a movie that evening. I typed back a quick yes, and smiled at how simple, healthy relationships could be when both people were honest about their intentions and respectful of each other's boundaries. As I gathered my things to leave for the office, I thought about the advice I'd give to any woman facing betrayal and deception in her own life. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't accept explanations that don't make sense. Remember that people who truly care about you Don't put you in positions where you have to choose between your own well-being and their convenience. And most importantly, don't let anyone convince you that seeking justice for wrongs committed against you is somehow petty or vindictive. Marcus and Victoria had made their choices, and they were living with the consequences. I had made my choices, and I was living with mine. The difference was that my choices had been based on truth, accountability, and respect for the people they would affect. Their choices had been based on deception, selfishness, and a fundamental disregard for anyone who might be harmed by their actions. Standing outside the coffee shop in the morning sunshine, I felt genuinely grateful for the first time since that awful wedding day. Not grateful for the betrayal or the pain, but grateful for the strength I'd discovered in myself when circumstances demanded it. Grateful for the reminder that I was capable of protecting myself and others when people in positions of trust chose to abuse that trust. The woman who'd been left at the altar had been a victim. The woman walking to her car to start another successful day at the company she'd built was a survivor. And there was all the difference in the world between those two identities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.